Hello, everybody. It is October 18th, and we are here for yet another edition of Mass Office Hours Live. And here I am with the champ, the man of the hour, the good Dr. Eric Helms, looking very, very lean, coming off some successful bodybuilding shows, and you still got more coming up. Is that right?
That is correct. I am only 10 days out from WNBF Australia in Brisbane. So that is the potentially second to last or third to last show I'll do the season, depending on how it goes.
All right. And when is the final show, you think? How long is this season extending?
The show ends at WNBF Worlds.
Okay.
So it is just a question of whether I'm competing on Saturday with the amateurs or I'm competing on Sunday with the pros.
Very cool. Awesome.
Yeah, man.
All right. So we have some very bodybuilding focused questions. So we're going to stay on theme in this episode. But before I do that, a little housekeeping note, or I guess two of them. First of all of our wonderful listeners who are in the live chat, we appreciate you so much for joining us. One thing I noticed in our last episode is that my microphone was much quieter than Lauren's. Not a big deal. It was audible. And perhaps only freaks like me who are obsessed with audio quality might have noticed. But if you're in the chat and there's ever something like that, or you hear a bunch of buzzing or anything like that, just let us know. Let me know in the chat. I'm reading it and I can control literally everything. I never enter a situation that I can't fully control. That's one of my deep personality flaws. So yeah, if there's ever a discrepancy in volume, just let us know in the chat. We'll change it. The other thing, we so much appreciate everyone who's been joining us so far as we've gotten our office hour concept rolling. If you like what we're doing and you want to support it, be sure to like the videos, rate them, subscribe, share. And I use all those different verbs because you can catch this on YouTube. You can catch it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts. So if you want to leave a review, preferably a good one. Yeah, look at that. Oh, it's that easy. Helms just showed on the camera how you like a video on YouTube. It's literally the click of one button. Very impressive. So, and by the way, we put these videos, the YouTube video goes up days before we go live. And we put the link in there if you want to submit some questions ahead of time. And if you follow us, you can't miss that link. It's all over the place. So if you want to submit a question, be sure to do that. But with that out of the way, Helms, we've got so many questions and I know you've got an hour. We want to keep it tight here. So let's start with the first one. Helms, did you find this prep easier or harder compared to others? And if so, what was the difference? What set it apart?
I would say it was easier. And a big part of that is that I very intentionally... Well, I think actually you talked about this recently, and I can't remember what medium you were talking about it on, but a huge part of the stress of prep for early competitors in their career is the unknown. And this extends even beyond prep, like the hyperphagia you experience, the food focus, the seemingly like, it doesn't matter how much I eat, I don't feel not hungry, or at least I don't feel satiated. How long is that going to last? And am I going to be 300 pounds in the next 6 months if I maintain this rate of weight gain? There's a version of that that goes all the way through to the whole prep. Like, oh man, is this crushing lethargy going to be like this on every day or only after refeeds or whatever? You know, like how long is it going to take for my legs to come in? All these things are very scary unknown waters until you've swam them before. So I think that in and of itself is absolutely something that allows you to go through prep with a little more acceptance and confidence and less insecurity. And that makes the process much easier. But I think much more than that, and on top of that, is that as you learn how your body responds and the time course it takes and all the associated variables to indicate when you're ready and what you have to do to get ready, you're much less prone to over diet and put yourself in a position where it's worse than it has to be. You talked about in this, I can't remember where you were talking about this, but I was listening to you speak about this.
I think it was on Iron Culture. I feel like I can't tell if you're being serious or if you want me, if you're begging me to plug the show that we co-host.
No, I literally could not remember if I was listening back to an office hours with you and Zerdos or you and Lauren, or it was one of the two Iron Culture episodes that I wasn't on, but I was like, damn it, I was listening to Eric talk about this.
I'm pretty sure it was Iron Culture. Yeah.
I think it was. I think you're 100% right. And good episode, by the way. Check out Iron Culture.
Thank you.
But in all seriousness, which we're definitely in the same multiverse as. I mean, half of the Iron Culture episodes are now what we call the mass cast.
Yeah.
But anyway, you were talking about this, and you had some very good insights. And you were saying there's all these converging factors which probably are causing us to feel like crap. Getting below our lower intervention point, doing a lot of activity as a vehicle for fat loss, creating a constrained energy output from other physiological systems, which is going to mimic metabolic adaptation, and it's going to mimic being below your intervention point, because all these things share a lot of mechanisms. And we can only control one of those, ultimately. You can not overdo cardio. You can not overdo the energy deficit that you're actually dieting on. But you can't not get below your intervention point. That's just called losing in bodybuilding. So I think most competitors, if I was to speak broadly, first timers all the way up to pros, they are dieting on lower calories than they need to at a certain point, or doing more cardio than they need to. And if they took a slower approach or came in and out of a deficit in a more intermittent fashion, they could mitigate the impact of those two variables. And that, with the psychological side of it, those two things combined, I think can make for a far easier prep experience. I'm at probably a 3 out of 10 difficulty at this point, and I'm just now touching down into what I would consider elite level conditioning. I had, for these last 3 shows, I did have striations in my glutes. I did have split hamstrings. Nothing was missing. It's what I've coined as legally shredded. Like you've met the criteria for shredded, but everyone saw Brian Whitaker in 2015 unite the titles. Like everyone's seen Philip Ricardo Jr. Like you could get tighter, you know?
Yeah.
So, and in my experience, the difference between going from legally shredded to holy shit, man, you are skinless, is being able to preserve your willpower so that you can keep pushing past that point where you are inevitably far below your intervention point, and so far below it that you might have to do things that create REDs or a constrained model, because they are all cooperating. You know, once you get far enough below your intervention point, and I wrote about this in our cover story, Why You Can't Stay Shredded, it just seems impossible to even eat at maintenance without being below thresholds often associated with the slow buildup of REDs via low energy availability. So I'm just now getting there, and I've been able to preserve a lot of willpower and diet on higher calories, do less cardio. My step count's not insane. And I think that requires the experience to know that, or at least a good coach. So those combined factors, I know it's a long answer to a simple question, are why I think this prep has been substantially easier than prior.
No, I think the long answers are good because they touch on a few topics that we actually have questions about in the outline, but also I think sometimes the answer to that type of question isn't what people are expecting. You know, I think a lot of times people would ask that type of question. Not saying the person asking had this in mind, but a lot of times when you get that question, it's you know, oh, I ate more protein this time around, or I did 2-a-day cardio instead of 1, or I did HIIT instead of low intent. Everyone's kind of looking for this strategic thing, but there's so much more that goes into the experience of a prep. And I know one of the things that unites us Helms is that we like reading a bit about Buddhist philosophy and Stoic philosophy. And it is really honestly amazing how much the dreaded absolute grind of prep is, to some extent, your reaction to how you're feeling rather than just the feeling itself, you know? And that's why, like when I tell people what you just said, which is just knowing what to expect matters so much for making your prep easier. It's because you don't torture yourself with the anxiousness over, is this going to last forever? What does it look like when I, try to do these next 4 weeks if the previous 4 weeks were so terrible? Like there's all of this doubt and uncertainty in your mind that causes a really meaningful level of distress. And when you can eliminate that and mostly deal with just the physiological part, you say, okay, I get hunger. I get, what lethargy feels like. and they're not fun, but I'm also not like worried and anxious 24 hours a day, which is a complete game changer. You did touch on a couple things here that we just so happen to have things on in the outline about. One of the things I meant to ask, we had a question from Ollie, and it was about tracking. Basically, if you're getting adequate protein and you're watching the scale, it's going in the right direction. Is it still optimal to just kind of loosely track like that versus, really diligently tracking your nutrition over time? I know in the past you've done a prep without any kind of tracking in terms of dietary tracking. Well, I wouldn't say without any kind, but you did not track your macros during a prep. I've done the same previously for most of it. Okay. So what's your approach?
Then I got the Banky out.
Okay. Yeah. So what's your approach this time around?
This time I said, I don't need the Banky. I'm a big boy. And I have not tracked yet. I have at times been given a specific calorie range by Berto based upon certain things, like because I'm actually peaking now and we need to manage a few more variables just for consistency's sake. But I have not entered any information into a tracking app except for when I was briefly in one of my student studies, where we did a peak week study on a mock peak week, which is pretty cool. Yeah. So only for science have I tracked. Now, I think, and you've actually done some great writing about this in Mass. When we talk about nutrition tracking, I think that people hear different things depending on where they're coming from. If you're in a bodybuilding circle, they think you went to a website or you had a coach who give you 3 specific numbers that you're supposed to hit on a day-to-day basis. You weigh it, and that's what guides your food decisions and your eating decisions. And you're having these numbers and you're fitting foods to hit them to hit your goal. And those numbers are put on a pedestal because they are putting you in some appropriate deficit based upon some calculations, right? And they're within appropriate ranges based upon science or experience or something like that. But tracking can mean a whole lot more than that. It can mean not modifying your diet at all and simply entering it into an app. And that can be an experience of reading nutrition labels, learning about your foods, figuring out, oh, actually nuts are not high in protein, they're high in fat. Oh, that's cool. And then auditing it and going, oh, if I wanted to increase my protein, what would I do? If I wanted to decrease my fat and increase my carbs, what would I do? And those are 2 very different things. And I think it's important to step outside of the bodybuilding mindset, because then, okay, so tracking doesn't have to mean that, but there's benefits to doing that, Eric. Why wouldn't you track? Well, then the question is, well, what are we tracking for? Tracking in and of itself is not a goal. It's a facilitative behavior to get to a goal. And if the goal is to reach a sufficient amount of protein to protect against lean body mass loss, to provide a sufficient amount of energy to not have drastic and immediate consequences of being too low, but still in a deficit to lose body fat, and to satisfy our health needs as best as we can while dieting, then, okay, how do I accomplish that in a way that's less stressful if I find tracking to be stressful, or if I don't need that tool to accomplish those outcomes? So for me, I don't track in that way to hit specific macronutrient targets, because I'm always aware of my caloric and macronutrient intake within a pretty reasonable degree because of my experience tracking for literally a decade prior. And I only look things up or track them or weigh them when they're unfamiliar foods, which I just don't eat that often. And most of the time, I'm simply just constructing meals that I know by the end of the day will get me into an appropriate intake. And then I'm auto-regulating that intake based upon things like my hunger, my energy levels, and my rate of weight loss. So I'm using biofeedback, both subjective and objective, to dictate the decisions I make. But every day, I probably know my caloric intake. So that is how I personally do it, and that's not necessarily what I recommend to people who don't have the level of experience that I have. And for those people, I have different recommendations, which we could get into, but I know I kind of interrupted your mid-question asking there.
No, I mean, that was my question really was, what you're doing this time around and why, So I remember I was running a small study, and we were helping people with some weight loss, and they were kind of checking back in and doing repeated body composition testing. And it was interesting because people were supposed to come back after they hit a particular weight loss threshold. And we weren't really the ones doing the intervention stuff. We were just kind of doing the analysis part of it with the body composition testing. And so, there were some folks who they would walk out the door and they wouldn't come back because they wouldn't hit that threshold. And then there were some folks who would hit that threshold and the next threshold and the next threshold. I mean, these were not small increments. I mean, these people were really cruising big weight loss goals. We're talking about people that are losing 50, 60 pounds of weight, right? And I will say one of the coolest things about that study was being able to sit down and chat with folks and say, hey, you're kind of lapping everybody in this study 3 or 4 times over. What are you doing? And these are not fitness enthusiasts. These were general population folks who were really pursuing a, structured weight loss intervention with guidance for the first time in their lives. And one of the things that I couldn't help but notice was that tracking was a very effective behavior that seemed to be in common for the folks who were excelling. But a bit to your point, I think a lot of that is these are folks who, for the first time ever, are becoming more mindful of their food choices. They are starting to kind of put together what a meal structure looks like. They are being, they're gaining so much knowledge about portion size and calorie content, and those aren't things that they had, they couldn't prior to that look at a plate of food and say 600 calories, right? I mean, that was not a skill set that they had built up yet. And no one builds that up until, honestly, they do something that kind of resembles tracking for a little bit, and so I think it's really fascinating. The question ultimately was, is it still optimal to pursue, this type of weight loss goal without tracking? And it certainly can be. But I think the question really comes down to, what are you actually doing, right? So if you are hitting numbers that are appropriate for you, but you're not physically tracking them, you're still doing the thing that the tracking was supposed to facilitate, right? And so if you feel like you have a good enough background experience level, if you feel comfortable that, you're going to be able to stay on track without that kind of quantitative feedback, I mean, ultimately, both of those roads can lead to the same place. It's just a question of, is that tool something that helps you along the way? For some people, yes. For others, maybe not. And yeah, I mean, I know some people really like the peace of mind that they get from saying, I know how much I tracked today. I weighed my things. I entered them into an app or a spreadsheet. And, for some folks, that gives them a lot of peace of mind. For other folks, maybe they say, I know I'm barely eating and I don't want to see that every day. Like, I'd rather just kind of get away from the numbers and focus on that tiny serving of food rather than having to interact with that number and all of the heavy emotional weight that comes with, I can't believe I just logged a whole meal and it was only 320 calories or something like that,
Mm-hmm. And I think also there is, I don't think we can say based on the data or even my experience coaching that tracking is a contributing factor or causative for disordered eating patterns or even just dietary stress. But I think it can contribute to things, especially in people with predispositions. And there is some observational data of people with eating disorders reporting that they track and that they feel it contributes to it. And that's not the same thing as it being causational in the average person. And it's probably not based on the data we have. But for some people, tracking could have that negative aspect to it where it forces them to be mindful of something they don't want to be mindful of, the poverty macros. And for others, it's just stressful. And it's just something that they don't want to deal with. And then when you get advanced enough, and if you have the right personality for it, it can be constraining. It's kind of like the training equivalent is when you get to a point where you have a top single in powerlifting, and it's an 8 RPE versus saying a 92% of 1 RM, where regardless of how you feel, if you're in a certain personality or mindset, you're going to try to do 92% of your last tested 1 RM. But you could be stronger. You could be leaving gains on the table. It could be suboptimal. And I think sometimes people frame autoregulation in powerlifting as holding someone or as holding someone back, but I think it can push you forward. I think the same thing is true with tracking. I feel that I actually perform better with this more intuitive, or I should say reflexive or biofeedback-based approach to my nutrition intake. So that I think that is one thing to consider, but there's absolutely things in the middle of tracking and not tracking. And something that I'm doing for the 3rd edition of my books, Trex, is figuring out a more simple and probably better way to embed flexibility. Because one thing that we do have to be mindful of and careful of when we're doing tracking and you have these macros to hit is that it actually is flexible dieting, not just flexible dieting TM, or if it fits your macros, where this calculator spits out 62 grams of fat, 153 grams of protein, and 161 grams of carbohydrate. And you feel like you're messing up when you haven't hit those specific grams, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, you can eat any foods you want, but now you're chasing down a grain of rice, and it becomes another version of rigid restraint, which supposedly, flexible dieting is supposed to push you towards flexible restraint and be a better option emotionally and less likely to cause issues, as we have seen associated with rigid restraint. So anyway, the way I'm changing my instructions, the prior second edition, first edition approach, which I used in the muscle and strength pyramids, was I had a good, better, best. So it's all positive terminology. And it was calories and protein, or macros within a certain range. And I'm actually going to get away from that and just recommend a calorie target and a minimum intake to prevent issues for all three macros. So for example, we've got not just Morton anymore. It's like 3 or 4 or 5 different meta-analyses that all cluster around 1.5, 1.6 grams per kg of protein is where you maybe stop seeing benefits, at least in a surplus in the studies we've looked at. Call it 0.7 gram per pound for the Americans. And you did some great work recently in mass that we also talked about on a mass cast, Iron Culture, on what's a reasonable minimal fat intake. And I can even say hard temporary dieting phase, normal dieting phase, like off season, and kind of like 20 to 30, 30 to 40, 40, 60, whatever. And then some reasonable carbohydrate intake informed by your goals and your training and your activity levels. Probably something around, like, while dieting, at least, 1 to 2 grams per kg or something like that. And then and your energy intake, that's going to be dictated by your fat loss goals. So instead of having that 3-tiered system, and instead of giving someone 3 targets for protein, carbs, and fat, I found it increasingly hard to justify as a coach why I need someone to consume 240 grams of carbohydrate, but not 250 and 5 grams less of fat. Because the margin of error and the meaningful differences and just differences in substrate utilization, there's no way I can justify that it actually matters. So it's actually, in my opinion, as a coach, especially with even a slightly more experienced competitor, it's a missed opportunity to allow them to have more day-to-day flexibility by giving them specific carbs, fat, and protein targets. But if I tell them, hey, at least hit 120 grams of carbohydrate, 160 grams of protein, and 30 grams of fat, but get to 2,000 calories or 1,900 to 2,100 calories and give them a range, now all of a sudden they have ability to have less social stresses. They can have more variety in their diet when they go to the grocery store, which I think helps with some of the digestive issues and micronutrient shortfalls that can occur in prep. And it generally just allows them to customize that to their lives and auto-regulate it on a day-to-day basis. It embeds that flexibility. And it's surprisingly counterintuitive to our community, which has been based upon give me 3 numbers to hit instead of give me 3 minimums to hit in service of getting to a calorie target. And I'm really interested to see if that'll take off, because it still allows you to be like, no, I tend to respond to higher carbs, lower fat. Well, cool. Well, the low end of what low fat is for you, and the lowest protein you want to be on. If you want to make all of the rest carbs and you respond better to that, or you like that better, do it.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the paradigm shift that I'm going to be taking in my books, and I have been doing with my clients, and I'm probably going to be promoting as we move forward, because I think it just makes more sense.
Yeah. I will say, and speaking of promoting, shameless promotion here, but that's one of the reasons I really like doing mass. It's not necessarily the easiest thing in the world, but it is a labor of love to write every month and to continue interacting with the research as it comes out, because we can do these kinds of things where we spend a few years just every month grinding, study by study, reconsidering some of our previous positions on things, or refining them, or shifting ranges where we used to say this much was enough. Now we're actually thinking it's higher or lower. And then every few years you can look back like you're doing with the new edition of your book and say, I think I'm ready to actually call this a new set of things I recommend, right? Because it doesn't happen all at once. It happens one thing by one thing. And all of a sudden you look back at the kind of cumulative aggregated set of things you've done in the last 3 years and you say, I think I actually like materially feel different about how I would recommend doing something, and it's kind of fun
100%.
to zoom out and watch that process happen over time, because it's just these little tiny things that are meaningful but small in isolation, and you zoom out and you say, wow, I'm a different coach, trainer, lifter than I used to be. It's cool.
Yeah. So it's not that I decide to write a new edition every 3 years. How long does it take my thinking to now look back at the old edition and be annoyed to the point where I need to change it?
Yeah. How many asterisks would you go through and put in right now? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Now, another question about prep. We had a question in here about refeeds. And the question was, how do you feel about 1 or 2 day refeeds for non-competitors? But I am just curious, did you happen to do any refeeds? Have you been doing refeeds during your prep?
Yeah, I have been. So it's gone through a few different iterations, but kind of the initial baseline period for a while was I just did refeeds when I felt the need. And that was based upon adherence, rate of weight loss, training performance, hunger, and social things that were going on, and my need to be active and energetic in different settings in my life. And it was largely just a sustainability component. And also, I would place it around high priority training. So if I'm training in the afternoon and it's my highest volume, weaker body part training day, or when I was closer to my powerlifting competitions, it was a strength day on the big 3, then I would have a refeed the day prior so that I would go into those sessions feeling much more energetic. And if it was an evening session, I would probably have the refeed primarily occurring in my breakfast, lunch, and then another little meal that I'd sneak in. So the acute performance benefits are notable. They're not huge. And there actually is a little bit of data on that. If you look at Dr. Pios's work on the enhanced muscular endurance in the legs that was observed during the diet break period, which is kind of cool.
And I will interject. A lot of folks, I'm sure, will be sitting there thinking, no, like a small bump in carbohydrate. I don't eat the same amount of carbs every day. I'm not seeing a damn thing, but it is different. Like when you're prepping and you're getting very, very lean and you're in a sizable surplus and your calorie intake is low, you do start to notice, wow, workout feels different when I've got a little bit more carbohydrate in my system. Do you happen to know how much extra carbs you're taking out on your refeeds?
Yeah, so my refeeds were generally around 2,500 calories, are generally around 2,500 calories, and my low days are anywhere between 1,400 and 1,700.
Okay.
And those are auto-regulated. So it's a sizable difference. I could be going 250 grams of more carbohydrate.
Yeah.
And then especially if I'm then doing that refeed before the training day, because I will often do that Saturday, Sunday, and I don't train Sunday. I feel great on Monday.
And you're doing 2-day refeeds? Okay.
Typically. Yeah. So the current setup is Saturday, Sunday, but I've been competing for the past 3 weeks, and I have not been taking refeeds. I've just been using the carb ups for the shows as my refeeds. So it's a little different now, and they're more based upon what do I need to look good on game day rather than the facilitating muscle retention and performance during fat loss. But if we kind of rewind the clock a month or two, I was doing Saturday, Sunday high days, and I would have my hardest training session, most important training session, you could say, on Monday to start the week off after an off day and an off day with high calories. And those training sessions felt almost off-season like. So, nice. And I think that's important, especially when we talk about muscle maintenance over, like a 8-month diet.
Yeah. So to the heart of the question itself, I wanted to get that little detour in there since you're prepping. I was curious about, and we've been talking about refeeds, you and me, back and forth for years, and I think that's one of the ones we've generally been on mostly the same page with. We've had to fight everybody else about it, but not each other, which is nice. But the question here by Sean, we're assuming it's an intermediate to advanced lifter, moderately lean in a moderate deficit. Would you put refeeds in the mix, or would you maybe make them an option and say take it or leave it? What would your approach be?
Yeah, I think if they don't necessarily have a bodybuilding goal, and we're not seeing negative effects of the diet on their goal-specific things we care about, like performance for a powerlifter or anybody, or it's whatever they're doing, I would absolutely use it as an option. I think we are on the same page with a lot of the intermittent dieting strategies, refeeds, and diet breaks. Currently, we only have data on trained individuals going from normal to leaner, rather than well-trained individuals going from normal to shredded. So a lot of the proposed metabolic benefits have not been tested because there has not been the presence of metabolic adaptation to see if it impacts it. But what has been consistently observed, actually in 2 different lab groups now, either in refeeds or actually primarily in diet breaks, is this feeling of making the diet easier, the reductions in disinhibition, so less cravings, if you will. Or not being as hungry, better appetite suppression, and even physiological signals for that. I think it was PYY or ghrelin was enhanced in the diet break group. I can't quite remember. So I think it can make the diet less stressful. And I think whether you can push through a hard diet versus whether you should are 2 different questions. I think anytime you have an opportunity to get to the same place but require less stress management to do it, that'll probably show up some more positively physiologically or psychologically. So I think, if there is any fatigue that creeps up, in throughout the course of a week or a mesocycle of dieting, if you will, and that could be alleviated by a diet break, and that might be worth having to diet a little bit longer.
Yeah.
But yeah, generally I do it individually.
Yeah. And Sean, to answer your question, my 2 cents on it, I like to, if I'm working with a client and I don't know if, on paper, a refeed or diet break strategy would be warranted, I try to crank up the communication, and I try to, read the tea leaves by looking at their numbers in the spreadsheet a little bit. And if things are starting to get a little flat in terms of performance, or if in our conversations, they're starting to be, I don't have that extra gear in the gym. Every time I think I'm going to do 12 reps, I get 10. I don't know where the other 2 are going. You can start to kind of keep your ear to the ground and figure out, are they starting to experience some of those performance changes that occur when you start to get kind of depleted? And I'm using that term very vaguely to describe this intersection of, I'm pretty lean, I've been dieting for a while, my carbs aren't as high as they used to be, I'm just kind of losing that extra gear that I could immediately replace if I had a really high carb day the day before, right? And it's one of those things that once you've felt it, you can kind of look for those signs and symptoms and say, oh, I think I have an idea of what's going on here, and you can experiment with it. So that's from the physiology side. But then from the practical side, I think talking with folks about, how burnt out are they with the diet, or how sick are they of the, low calories on Saturday when they're trying to hang out with their friends. There are practical elements where you might say, I think your quality of life might just get better. You might just enjoy what we're doing more if you have a little more flexibility a couple days of the week. And maybe they won't even really miss those lower calories Monday through Friday. They're busy at work, they're running the kids around, they're not even really thinking about food those days, but it's the weekends when, the days are long, there's a lot of leisure time. Leisure time often comes with feeding opportunities in social situations. So there's a lot of reasons to do it. I certainly wouldn't say that it's a must-have for really anybody. I think it's a good idea to at least try or at least experiment with if you're doing a competitive bodybuilding type diet. Might as well take a look at it and see if you derive some benefit from it. It's not for everybody. I mean, I've said for a while, I think that refeeds can be very useful, and I don't use them. Like when I prep for bodybuilding competitions, I don't, because I don't like thinking about what I'm eating. I prefer, like, I'm one of those people that if I could be in like the worst situation in the world, Helms, and if nobody told me it was a bad situation, I don't think I'd know.
There is, I mean, honestly, there's a lot to be said, kind of going back to some of the philosophical points you made earlier. For like, I mean, there's actually empirical data on this acceptance-based therapy, right? Making weight loss more successful and weight loss maintenance more successful compared to like traditional mental coaching that someone would receive during a weight loss period. And I can tell you anecdotally, being distracted is by far the best diet hack out there. Being a busy person, you look up and you're like, oh crap, I'm 4 weeks out, and yeah, I'm shredded, you know. So anything that draws attention to the negative experience of dieting can, if that's what it serves, is not helpful. The only time, like if we worked together, we would have to have a conversation about that, because I find there's a lot of utility in seeing how one's appearance changes in response to a refeed, because it informs what we're going to do in peak week.
Yeah.
So it'd be one of those things of like, well, dude, you haven't had more than 150 grams of carbs in 4 months. I'm not even sure you can digest this shit anymore, you know?
Yeah.
And I'd prefer you to not look like you do right now, depleted and shredded on stage. And I would like to not shoot in the dark, you know?
Yeah.
So it would be like, you know, okay, well, let's figure out a way that makes this not hard. Maybe we start eating up into the show when we get lean early.
Yeah.
And then you're just not depleted going into the show. We don't have to do much. I just give you one extra meal, and that's real safe. But that's hard to do. Not everyone can get shredded 6 weeks out.
I'm also weird, though. I don't really do much to peak at all. I kind of just, I get lean enough and I say, hey, I'm lean enough. That's good. And then I just kind of maintain, and I'll have like an extra 60 grams of carbs the day before the show. And that'll be kind of it. But yeah.
We have a discussion about that too. Like, would you like to perform better? You know?
would it hurt? But, yeah. So, I don't know. I definitely, yeah. If I were like, hey, this is like, we're really going for it, this is like a huge show, it's so important to me, what I would probably do is honestly prep the same way I always do and not have all the fluctuations. And like, I got in this groove when I was prepping where I wasn't tracking stuff, I wasn't doing the ups and downs. It was just like, hey, if I eat this amount of food and I keep training my butt off, I'm going to get lean and I'm still going to have muscle. And hey, what do you know? It worked out. And what I would do is just do that until I felt like I was lean enough and the body fat reduction was taken care of. And I'd say, all right, Helms, let's do some practice peaks because we're ready ahead of time. Like I would just get ready 8 weeks ahead of time, 6 weeks ahead of time, and we could do a few practice peaks and we'd be good to go. So
honestly, that would work, because then what we would do is over those 8 weeks, we would just, the one time Trexler and I are going to endorse reverse dieting.
Oh, wow.
When you're actually not done with your season and you're reverse dieting to the point, like strict reverse dieting, I'm not going to gain any fat, just want to get my carbs as high as they can and my fat a little bit higher and eat as much as I can and reduce my step count and maintain this leanness. It's magic.
Yeah.
Spoiler alert, you're still going to feel like shit, but you will look better and you will regain some lost fullness and maybe even muscle. And then then we can actually go right back to what you're used to. And I'll just have an extra 60 grams of carbs on Friday. Yeah. Right? Because you're going to be at like a 1% deficit, or whatever.
Yeah.
And that'll push you up. And that is basically what I did in 2019 for my last 2 to 3 shows.
Yeah.
And it works just fine. You kind of look like you're ready every day, and you can just get a little top off, and then you just pop a little more, and you're good to go.
Yep. A little sodium, get a pump, you're good to go.
Mm-hmm.
Want to respond to something in the chat here. Bob said, bummer, didn't click to see the change to question format. I'm not sure what that's referring to, but I figure I'll clarify the format. It's office hours, folks. So if you're here for the first time, what we do is we try to jump into the chat, answer questions from listeners. In this case, we had a bunch of questions that came in through our we've got a link to submit questions. It's always open. And we got a bunch of bodybuilding ones, and I just wanted to throw him at Helms while he's here, because, I mean, why not? He's in the thick of it right now between shows. But yeah, so if you want to jump in on office hours, we try to get as many questions as we can from the chat. We get them from the submission portal that's open 24/7, 365. Helms, I had another question that is somewhat bodybuilding related. I think this might be the last one from my little cluster of questions I've been collecting here. pertaining to bodybuilding. So this is one that I actually am going to take the lead on, and then I'm going to ask you what you normally do. So got a question about reducing step count. Now, a lot of times folks are saying, hey, I need to be more active. I noticed that I'm more sedentary than I thought. I'm trying to lose some weight or, improve some cardiovascular outcome, cardiometabolic outcome. How do I get more steps? In this case, it's a scenario that I'm sure anyone who's a fitness pro has probably seen, which is I have gotten really used to a really high step count, and I'm starting to think it's too much. Like I think I need to be less psychologically dependent on having a very high step count to convince myself that I'm burning enough calories throughout the day and all those sorts of things. So in this case, the scenario is step count has kind of been increasing and increasing as a bit of a crutch to kind of feel like, okay, I'm definitely active enough. Gotten up to about 25,000 steps a day. And the goal is to get that lower because 25,000 steps a day takes a lot of time. It can be, potentially a bit fatiguing, depending on what you're doing when you're not taking those 25,000 steps a day. And so the question is, how do I get those down to a more manageable level based on my lifestyle, maybe 10 or 15,000? But I really don't want to gain weight. I don't want to gain fat in the process. I don't want to just do nothing and just go 25,000 to 15 or 10,000 and have no other accommodation, right? Because one might expect that would put someone, if they were at maintenance, into positive energy balance. So I wanted to throw just a really quick thing, some heuristics here to kind of help people go through this in their head. And then I want to ask you a little bit about step counts during your current prep and what you're planning to do maybe after prep. So really quickly, for a question like this, the numbers I'm about to say are not perfect for a million different reasons. These are very, very rough heuristics, but it's often said that going a mile, walking, jogging is usually about 100 calories. And I'm going to say calories instead of kilocalories here, but that's what I mean. Also, roughly, back of the napkin type math here, maybe about 2,000 steps a mile, depending on your stride length. And so if we use those two basic numbers that, like I said, are extremely rough approximations, then we would calculate 1,000 steps is about 50 calories and 5,000 steps is about 250 calories, which honestly, not a bad estimate, right? So if someone said, hey, I'm going to drop from 25,000 to 15,000, just purely based on the math, if I was trying to adjust my diet, what would I do? I might not go for that 10,000 step drop. I might not go all the way to 500, but I'd probably be somewhere within that 250 to 500 if I was just worried about the numbers. Now, in a real coaching scenario, I wouldn't just be worried about the numbers. I would say, hey, let's figure out why we're doing this whole trading steps for calories arithmetic, right? So when you start dealing with the other elements of coaching, it gets a lot more complicated. But for folks who are wondering just like, how would this work? Those would be the most basic numbers possible. But I would put quite a few caveats in here. I mean, any kind of exercise, there's going to be economy, right? So some people are going to be able to walk or jog more efficiently than others, so their expenditure per step is going to be different. People are going to have different stride lengths, which is going to throw these numbers off a little bit. And something we've talked about a lot, if you're doing 25,000 steps a day and perhaps you've been kind of restricting your diet for body composition reasons, you would be kind of a prime candidate for someone who might have some exercise energy compensation. You might be kind of having an adaptive reduction in the energy cost of your exercise because you are basically pulling calories from elsewhere or constraining them elsewhere, so to speak. So you might be the type of person who the calories that you're getting from your, the increase in total daily energy expenditure that you're experiencing from this walking might not actually be as big as you think, which might sound like a bummer. But the good news is, if that is true, then when you go down to 15,000 steps from 25,000, you might not have to make much of a large dietary change to accommodate that. So there's kind of pros and cons there. You might feel like you got ripped off, but the good news is, hey, those steps haven't been doing as much as you thought in terms of your total daily energy expenditure. So for that reason, like I said, I'm putting all the real elements of coaching aside where you start to have that talk about, hey, we need to make sure we have a really healthy relationship with our step count, our activity level, our energy intake, and how those all work together. But just in terms of the math, if I was in that situation and all the other factors were kind of being addressed very effectively and it was just purely a math problem, if I was going down from 25 to 15,000 and I was going to say, how much should I adjust my calorie intake to accommodate that, I'd maybe start in the 200 to 300 calorie range and kind of work it down as my step count goes down and just kind of see where my body weight settles and go from there. But Helms, I'm curious about your thoughts on this question. I'm also curious about if you've been doing anything at all with step counts during prep.
I have, yeah. So I have Fitbit, which accuracy of step count is what it is, but and honestly, reliability is what it is. But I see it as just like a general activity amount. Mm-hmm. And we have definitely seen when we have targets for our clients, and I've seen it myself, that nutritional manipulations, when that's held constant, seem to result in more reliable outcomes or changes on scale and visually. So for the first 2/3 of prep, my target was 7K as a minimum, and plus or minus 500. And depending on which meta-analysis you look at, or meta-regression, or study, right around 6,000 to 8,000 steps is where you start to see no negative effect of sedentariness. And you are not maxing out, but you're potentially getting the most benefit as far as the ROI on activity for all-cause mortality and health. And this also coincides with some other good stuff: metabolic regulation, hunger regulation, not just not dying. So, and that's in people who aren't training 5 to 6 days per week, like myself. So I very much think that from a health perspective, a hunger management perspective, a metabolic perspective, that doing 6 to 8K steps per day and training on more days per week than not with weights, and you are probably getting more than the lion's share of any potential health benefit from activity. So that is kind of my default setting. And then I just made sure I was rigid about it. Like, I'm gonna get at least 7 during prep. And then at a certain point, we decided to go to 10 to 12K along with one of my adjustments. And I've been there since, essentially. And I'm allowed to get a little extra credit on some days in the same way that I'm allowed to go down to as low as 1,400 or as high as 1,700, depending on all these little auto-regulatory factors. And I typically don't combine those two things. I don't do 14K steps and 14,000, like the low end, because it's kind of like, chalk and oil, right? They don't mix, right? You're reducing energy while you're increasing expenditure, and that's when I tend to feel the worst. So general thoughts are that for someone who has a very, very high step count, in my experience, the reduction in energy expenditure is not nearly as much as you'd anticipate, even when you make relatively drastic, abrupt changes. And the only time that I would do it in a more tapered fashion or stepwise is when I'm also tightly controlling the calorie intake. Yeah. So if, let's say, you're doing 25,000 steps and you're eating within 100 calorie kind of variance, we might come down to 20,000 steps as the first thing and see how that goes. If you are more of a habit-based dieter and you're just doing 25,000 steps, believe it or not, I'd actually be a lot more comfortable cutting you right down to 15,000, because I actually think that your energy intake would, to some degree, be better regulated. You're kind of at the point where you're like driving your hunger up with that level of activity, probably experiencing energy compensation, and you'd probably see a better hunger regulation, less drive from activity, and more efficiency, or I should say less efficiency in your energy output from the steps you're getting. And you might find that you don't gain weight at all, despite the fact that you cut 10,000 steps, if you just kind of keep maintaining the same qualitative eating habits, and you'll just find that you don't eat as much. You may not even notice it. So the data is encouraging on this front. I know I've talked about this in mass, but I don't know that I have on office hours. But there's what's called the J-shaped curve. That's the relationship between body weight, energy intake, and energy expenditure. And this has been based upon multiple studies. One of the most interesting ones is the Bengali Mill study, where they looked at the factory, and they had 4 different categories of factory workers, from very high energy expenditure to high but kind of normal factory working. And they looked at the managers who had sedentary jobs, and they were like 10 kilos heavier, eating a similar amount to the second highest, most active workers on the floor. And that's the J portion of that energy intake, while all the factory workers from low active, and again, this is factory worker low active, still very high, all the way up to the highest activity, had the same average body weight, but they had a linear relationship with their energy intake and energy expenditure. They were in the quote unquote regulated zone. And it seems that as humans, based upon just having been hunter-gatherers for the vast majority of our evolution, we can put on our evolutionary biology hat, guess why this is. We don't do well with being sedentary. And in like acute trials where someone's only constrained to getting 1,500 steps or 2,000 steps, and you chuck them on a treadmill after you give them a bolus of triglyceride and or glucose, they don't sequester those nutrients as well. And the exercise is not as effective as a metabolic regulator, and that goes hand in hand with hunger regulation. So there's a certain level of activity that we're quote unquote supposed to have, I think, hormonally and metabolically. And there's a certain level that will start compensating, like Trexler talked about. So in my mind, I like to see it as what's an appropriate minimum for health, performance, longevity. And then if you want to get extra credit on top of that because you like it, or because it's a goal or fitness, or you just enjoy being outside, all these good reasons, not a fear-based reason, then more power to you. But be aware that you probably can bring yourself all the way closer down to that 7K or 8K value or something like that. And so long as you're not just rigidly tracking and hitting numbers, you probably won't qualitatively experience the diet being any harder, and you may be able to maintain weight, just like was demonstrated in that regulated zone of the J-shaped curve.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer. And it's one thing I would throw in there is it's interesting to note that not all steps are created equally, especially in the fitness space. First of all, I think before I get into that, I just want to mention, I like the way you framed it as almost like steps are something that just kind of help us standardize things. Like they make your nutrition responses more predictable. Because that's all we're trying to do, in my opinion, with step counts in a weight loss situation is we want to get you to a level of physical activity that's compatible with your goals. We do not want to use step counts as a driver of fat loss, because I just think it's not good for that. I'm not saying it has no impact, but I just think it's not the right tool for the job, because you do get to some really cumbersome step counts very, very quickly. It is a very inefficient route to take. So I wanted to make sure I mentioned that. But the other thing is, specifically in the fitness world, somewhere along the line, before I got into fitness, it became very popular to do incline walking. But a lot of folks hang on to the treadmill for dear life when they're doing incline walking. And if you take a clinical exercise physiology course, the first rule, the second rule, the third rule, and the fourth rule of clinical stress testing on a treadmill, unless there is a medical reason that they must hold on to the handrails during the test, you do not let someone hold on to the handrails during the test. The reasoning for that, even for flat walking, is it dramatically changes the energy cost of that exercise. It makes it less strenuous. And in the clinical realm, they care because there are some heart arrhythmias that you're not going to be able to really find on an ECG or EKG unless you reach a pretty strenuous effort. And in some cases, just having your hands on the handrails while doing that stress test can be enough to keep you from that zone. So an arrhythmia goes undetected, and the stress test didn't do what it was supposed to do, right? I mean, it's a failed test. So that also applies with lower stakes when you're getting in your step counts. If you're, hanging on for dear life on the treadmill and you're like, well, what's going on? I'm walking this many miles or this many minutes or this many hours. Back in the day, people would just hang on to that thing for 2 hours in the morning. I don't know if people are still doing that, if it still is trendy in fitness, but yeah, when you're doing something, for instance, the Stairmaster, the step mill machine, or I forget the difference between the two, but when you're doing the little treadmill that's actually steps, if you're doing an incline treadmill, if you're holding on to the railings, you probably aren't burning nearly as many calories as you think. And there's a reason that your first response is to hold on to them, because it gets way easier, way quicker. Now, caveat, if you need to hold them, right? I mean, if you have a balance perturbation, I don't want you falling off the big stair machine, because that thing's pretty high up in the air. That wouldn't be a fun fall. So it really is a catch-22 with that machine, where it's like, if I'm giving someone guidance on how to use it, I'm like, don't use the handrails, but don't fall off. If you're going to fall off, use the handrails, but then stop using the hand. Basically, I don't recommend that machine very often, because it's tricky. Because once you start having this kind of, sometimes you're grabbing them, sometimes you're not, the energy expenditure gets pretty unpredictable. And if you're going to be holding on to them the whole time, you might as well just be doing something else, to be totally honest.
Totally agree.
All right, Helms. Well, I tell you what, man, I know we got to get you out of here. It's just about that time. This was one of those odd office hours episodes where we just had a huge collection of really great questions that have been building up from people who have sent them in throughout the week. So very thrilled to be getting those. I'm going to take some time to look over everything that came in the chat and try to get to some of those next week, because we did get fantastic questions. I appreciate so much everyone who is in the chat tonight participating with us. I think we've got some great questions in here that we will try to get to very soon. Thank you, everyone, for joining us live here. That is the best way to get in on the action, to ask questions, to push back when Helms says something ridiculous. That's the best way to do it. And mark your calendars, because we're going to be back in exactly 1 week. It's always Wednesday night, 7 p.m. Eastern time. If you like the show and you want to support it, like I said previously, be sure to like, rate, subscribe, share, do all that stuff. Helms showed you earlier. It was very easy. It's just one button. I can't believe how convenient they make it. But yeah, be sure to share it, spread the word. It is free after all. We won't charge more to bring more people into the fold here. And keep submitting those questions. I've been so thrilled with how good those questions have been. And of course, if you really love what we're doing, you could also consider subscribing to the Mass Research Review. That's where we spend years formulating our thoughts week by week, month by month, and then we write new editions of books, as Helms showed us today. But Mass Research Review, every single month, the first of the month, we publish a brand new issue covering the most important, the most useful science as it pertains to fitness, health, nutrition, training, all that good stuff that we all care about. So once again, thank you so much for joining us tonight, and I'll be back to see you again in exactly 1 week.